Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingston, Texas, USA, with another episode of Rabbi Chaim Coffman's Controversial Issues. This week, we are going to do part 2 of what we did last week. Welcome back, Rabbi. Welcome back, everybody. It's a pleasure, and looking forward to seeing what kind of controversial stuff you're going to drag us into again this week.
Because that's why you have me here. It's all about the ratings.
It
right?
is. Yeah, we got to keep those ratings up, no doubt. All right. So
Come on, you got to buy more coffee.
Huh?
If you got him more coffee, he'd be happier. He'd be like jumping up and down like me.
You
That's what someone commented. Why does it seem that all rabbis yell and scream? So I could have answered, just turn the volume down a little bit. But don't mix up yelling and screaming for passion. We have passion for Torah.
Yep.
So there's a difference, sort of.
Sort of. That's a
Sort
broad, that's a broad spectrum. Okay. Hello, Tally Decker. Good to see you out there. Or Deckel. Sorry if I mispronounced that. All right. Well, take it away, boss. It's all yours.
All right, pleasure to be here. As always, we started last week. We didn't get very far. A, because you made me start late, and you made me end early. So
I know,
see if we
right?
get through this. That had nothing to do with me, by the way. I was good. I didn't blast anyone's system. I didn't destroy anything.
Yep.
You know, we're trying to keep this clean. So we spoke last week, or we started, about mental health issues and halacha and Jewish law, and how that there's a difference between actually doing the mitzvah, right, establishing the mitzvah, and can someone, that was really the question, which we didn't really address, which we're hopefully going to get to today, and that is, how does somebody do a mitzvah properly if they have mental lapses, right? Let's say they have schizophrenia. Let's say they are bipolar, and, they're either off the medication or there's a problem with the medication, whatever the case is. We mentioned a case last week of someone who had a questionable conversion and they had mental issues. And basically what I was told, my Rebbe told me, that if you can't prove, or there's a question about the conversion, person's been religious for like 20 years, 25 years. So you basically get him when he's lucid, when he is, when he's with it, so to speak, not delusional, and then you convert him. So, and when the person is not delusional on the medication, they're normal, right? They're pretty much normal like everybody else, unless we're saying everyone else is normal, but normal relatively speaking. So therefore, while they are, let's say, in a state of, let's say manic depression, or, they're hallucinating other things, pretty much they are going to be exempt from any mitzvahs whatsoever. Right? And the reason is very simple, is they're not in their right mind. Right? They're basically somebody else. They're just somebody else in another, in the same body, just whatever. They're just doing different things that they're not, they're not recognized for who they, for who they really are. So now the question really becomes, which we're going to sort of deal with by certain things, and that is how do we look at, somebody who has these episodes and they do something, they cause damage, or they go against Jewish law. They break Jewish law due to mental illness. So simply we should say, well, if they're really not in their right mind, right? If they're not in their right mind, then they're exempt. Then really they should be exempt. First of all, they're exempt from doing mitzvahs, that's for sure, right? Because they're not in control. But not necessarily being in control, this word gets a little bit dodgy, right? As the English would say. Why does it get a little bit dodgy? Because if they cause damage, they cause someone damage, whatever it is, why shouldn't they be liable? They actually did it. If they did it, it doesn't really matter. If they're under the influence, let's say someone's under the influence of alcohol, under the influence of drugs, right? We know that, God forbid, someone who's drunk, they injure someone, God forbid, they kill someone, that's vehicular homicide, right? I don't think they give them too many chances over here, because of the severity of what they've done. Again, they could be high on drugs, they could, They could have a high alcohol level. And a person, maybe we could say, well, they're really not in control, right? If they're not in control, they cause damage or even worse, then why should they necessarily be liable, right? That would be the question. Why should they be liable? Simple reason they should be liable is because we're liable for our actions. Just because the person was under the influence, you did it to yourself, right? It doesn't matter you had a drinking problem. It doesn't matter, you have a drug issue or whatever. You basically did it to yourself. Mental health and mental issues, person doesn't necessarily do it to themselves. It can be caused by trauma. It can be caused by, chemical imbalance, right? There are many things that are caused by chemical imbalance that, if they don't put the chemicals, in balance, so to speak, then a person can be haywire. They can be, they can be at the top of the world one day, totally depressed the other. That's why they need medication to regulate it. So the question is, if someone did it to themselves, they drank too much. And let's say they didn't necessarily have a drinking issue. They just drank too much, right? And, they caused damage. They caused an accident. God forbid they killed someone. That's totally different, right? That we should look at totally different for one very simple reason. They're in the right mind, right? They're not having mental lapses over here. They drank too much, right? They did something where they never should have done it. So that's a totally different issue. Now, but the question is, okay, let's say someone's forced to break Jewish law. They're forced to break halacha by mental illness, right? Well, we'll give an example by being someone who's OCD, right? Obsessive compulsive. I won't forget the D disorder, right? Someone like that if they do certain things.
Could I give you a different example?
By mental illness. So therefore,
Rabbi,
they should be excused from the violation.
Let's use a different example.
Now,
Rabbi, instead of let's use suicide. That's been brought up in chat, and that's probably one of the greatest topics of all that I've heard in argument for and against. So, what is the Orthodox view on? Because clearly, if somebody is willing to take their own lives, they probably have already lost it mentally. So, could you express on that?
Yeah, I guess you don't want to hear about OCD. That's too easy. That's why we get all the tough questions. We don't shy away from these tough questions.
There you go.
So suicide, you're 100% right. Most likely someone who's going to commit suicide, they've hit pretty much rock bottom. Right? And it doesn't really matter. We don't really care why. We're not necessarily interested, in the whole story behind it. The reality is that someone has to be in a really bad state. Forget, I would say forget mental illness, but it's really, you can't do that. It's really part and parcel of mental illness. So if it's part and parcel of mental illness, a lot of people are going to be given slack. Why? Because because in this case, most likely, right before they do what they do, they have 100% totally lost it, right? They are not in their right mind. Now, we mentioned about damaging others. So now you want to hit the question, what about damaging yourself, right? What about causing damage to yourself? In this case, you kill yourself. Now, there are repercussions, right? Even before we get to the nitty gritty, I just want people to understand, if somebody is considered sane, to whatever extent, and that's going to be a big discussion, right? But to whatever extent, and they understand what they're doing, then there are repercussions. The repercussions are that a Jew, would not be buried in a Jewish cemetery. There would be no mourning customs. There would be no resurrection of the dead, right? That is pretty down severe. And the reason is because no one's allowed to take anyone's life. Not only anyone else's life, right? But certainly not their own, right? It doesn't matter. You want to say euthanasia, and it's mercy. It's mercy for the patient. It's mercy for the family. All these things. We hold it's murder, right? It doesn't really matter. That's called murder. Someone takes their own life. Now, every single person who's going to do this most likely has some sort of mental illness. Right? They have to have some level of mental illness, as you mentioned before. 100% they're not in the right mind. Because most people are not going to do that. That's pretty drastic. Right? But there are people in a tremendous amount of pain, and you see it by teenagers, by young adults that, they OD, they overdose, they drug overdose, many different ways, but they're doing why are most people doing it? It's because they're in pain. Whether they weren't loved by the parents, whether, parents were divorced, caused problems that way, learning disabilities, never fit in, embarrassed in public. Oh, there are a million different things. Why this could happen is interesting statistically. Statistically, in the Orthodox Jewish community, unfortunately, there is a phenomenon of teenage suicide. And most cases of teenage suicide, the number one cause of teenage suicide is because of, sexual abuse. That's the number one cause. There could be, other causes down the line, but that is probably the number one cause. And unfortunately, it's a phenomenon in this, in this generation, something that, whatever, it's a stigma people never get over. It's a hard thing. It's a trauma. There's no question. There's no question about it. Now, on the other hand, so first of all, we say, okay, these people are in tremendous amount of pain. They're not in their right mind, right? They've hit the bottom, right? They've hit the bottom, so to speak. So if they do something wrong, and that's what we're going to speak about OCD, but we'll get there. If they do something wrong and it's caused by mental illness, they 100% should be excused, right? It's an excused violation. Why? Because they're not doing it. It's the illness, right? So now I could say that now. How far does that go? I could say that causing someone damage. I could say that by causing damage to myself, right? Or someone causing damage to themselves to the extent where they end up taking their own life. Now, someone to do that, 100%, there's something else going on, right? 100%, they will be, they're issues, right? There are definite serious trauma, mental issues, whatever. There are a lot of different reasons, potential reasons why. But at the end of the day, we don't necessarily care, except for the fact that there's a lot of talk about the fact that someone who does this, right, as we mentioned, they're in a lot of pain. They've gone through trauma. They've gone through other things. So if that's the case, they really shouldn't be liable, right? The reality is they shouldn't be liable. The only question's going to be is how far do we go? How far do we say, that it's really 100% mental illness? In other words, let's say someone had was in psychosis, through let's say drinking, let's say they hallucination through schizophrenia, they think they can do all kinds of things, whatever. So that's not really them. The proof would have to be that you would have to try and show that that some aspect of them, by doing this, they really know what they're doing, right? They really know what they're doing. So what about, we could ask the question, what about self-assisted suicide, right? What about Mr. Kevorkian? It's also suicide. Here, though, there's a difference. There's a major difference, because the person who's doing is pushing the button, whatever, they understand 100% what they're doing. They understand the terminal, right? They're not going to get better. If anything, they're going to get worse. They may get a lot worse. So what do they decide to do? They decide, okay, I'm going to end my life over here. And they're doing it because they don't see any hope. They don't see any future. Now, we could say, well, that's a really drastic thing to do, right? That's the last thing anyone ever wants to do. Now, that may be true, except if they really understand what's going on. If they're totally in control, I'd say 100%, they're liable over here, because they understand what's happening. They understand what's going on with their body. They understand that the terminal, however long it's going to last, and let's say they know it's only going to get worse, right? So what do? So they do it to themselves, whether they do Kevorkian's machine, they OD on who knows what, whatever it is, they do it to themselves. So that's going to be shown, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that's going to be shown that they're in their right mind. Now, if they're in their right mind, right, there are no hallucinations over here, we could still say, well, a person is extremely distraught, right? They're under a lot of pressure. There are other things going on, right? Depression certainly could be part of it. There are a number of things going on. So who's to say when somebody does that, we can say, why do we call that suicide? Because it takes a lot to be able to do that. Even though they understand they're going to die. They understand it's only a matter of time and they may suffer or go through tremendous amount of suffering. It still takes a lot to say, you know what, I'm done. I don't want to go through this. So anyone who does something direct with the understanding of exactly what they're doing, so that would be an easier case. That'd be an easier case of suicide because even though you may say the underlying cause is really, it's still a mental health issue. The reality is there is some level of mental health here. But even if you want to tell me it's mental health, nonetheless, they're not that far gone. Their mind is still there. They know what's going on. They just don't want to live this way, right? So if they do it in a direct way, so that'll be murder. That'll be suicide, and we'll throw the book at them. Now, we can have sympathy. There's no question, right? What they're going through is a very hard thing. They're suffering in different ways, physically, mentally, but there's a reality. It would be a lot easier if, let's say, I know someone recently, a number of months ago, had a stroke, wasn't going to be able to live the life they wanted. So what they did was they basically refused to eat. They ate minimally, they drank minimally, they went into hospice, they died. They died like a few months later. Now, why is that not considered suicide? That's not considered suicide because it's not direct. It's 100% indirect. They're just not taking medication. They're not intaking food. They could have lived however many years. Right? They might not have lived, quote unquote, quality of life that they wanted to. That may be true. Someone claimed, well, this person, the person suffering so much, they couldn't even do Sudoku. Like that. That means quality of life over here that you can't do Sudoku. Right? So I'm not even going to go there. But the point is, they didn't do anything direct. It was indirect. And this is what goes on in hospices all the time, where someone, let's say, has cancer. Right? We'll get to suicide in a second, but we'll just answer this other part. That someone who has cancer, what happens? So they put them in hospice. They know they're going to die within a short amount of time, a week, 2 weeks, could be a month, whatever. They don't starve them to death. That would be forbidden, right? That hospitals really aren't allowed to do. So they give them minimal to eat, minimal to drink. So what happens? What's the secondary cause of cancer? Secondary cause of cancer is pneumonia. Right now, they get pneumonia. They can't fight it off. Why? Because their body's so weak. Because the body's so weak because they gave them barely enough to survive. But since they had enough really to survive, they didn't not feed them. I mean, there's some cases where you see people don't get fed, and they basically starve to death, right? So that's murder in and of itself. That's something else. But if they're given minimal amount, and I had this question a number of years ago, asked the question, and the doctor told me they give them minimal amount to survive. But secondary cause of cancer is pneumonia. So but the thing is, they're not starving them to death. So since they're not starving them to death, it's secondary. It's not direct. If it's indirect, it's not. We don't consider it murder. Murder has to be something that's 100% direct. So in this case, it's a very fine line, right? They also know if they want to sedate them, make sure they're not in pain, they're going to give them morphine. But if they give them too much morphine, they'll kill them, right? So they have to give them a certain amount to keep them comfortable without killing them. So even if they do that, again, that's not murder over here, right? That's something that is indirect, unless they give them enough, obviously, to kill them. So something that is indirect, we don't consider it murder. Someone who's in their right mind, and they do it to themselves, even though it is a pretty drastic thing to do. Person could be younger, could be older, doesn't matter. They could be, they could be in their late 80s, could be in their mid 90s. It really doesn't matter. They don't think they're going to have quality of life. Life isn't worth living. They're going to die. They're going to suffer tremendously, over a certain amount of time. Why should I go through that? I don't want to have to go through that. So I'm not willing to do it. So they take their lives. Now, again, it's a very depressing thing. They're at a certain point where they say, okay, I'm not going to have this. I'm not going to have that. So they're going to decide to end their life. But they're doing it with free choice. They have free choice of mind. They're not like, their mind's not clouded. They know exactly, what they're doing. I knew of somebody just throw this indirect story one step further, and that is they had a kidney transplant about 30 years ago, more than that, probably 40 years ago. And then, like 25 years later, 30 years later, the other kidney starts to fail, and they're not a kidney recipient. They can't get another kidney transplant. Now, how is the only way they're going to survive? The only way they can survive is dialysis. Dialysis is very painful. You got to be there, twice a week, 3 times a week. Takes away from quality of life. Okay, that's definitely true. At the same time, if you don't go on dialysis, what's going to happen? You'll die. This is what's going to happen. So this person decided, they were in their mid-70s, they decided, I don't want to go through dialysis. I don't want to go through suffering. So since they didn't want to go through suffering, they didn't do any heroics. They ate what they want. They did what they want. And 2 months later, they died. They died. So I asked my Rebbe this question, is that considered murder? Is that considered suicide? And he said no. And the reason is exactly what we said. It's indirect. Right? They didn't take the medicine. But if they would have gone on dialysis, they could have lived, a number of years, potentially a number of years. They didn't want to go through the pain. They didn't want to suffer. So we have precedent. Right? The Talmud has precedent in such a case. Right? And the Talmud brings down, different cases like that. The person doesn't want to suffer. They don't want to go through heroics. All these different things does not mean they have to take the medicine. They don't have to take the medicine. And if they choose not to take the medicine, so then what would we say? Right? That's indirect. If it's indirect, it's not murder. Right? But essentially they're taking their own life. You're right. That's what they're doing. The body's going to deteriorate. You can't get the toxins out. You die. Right? That's what's going to happen. That's exactly what did happen. Right? But as my Rebbe said, it's indirect. If it's indirect, there's no issue. There's no issue over here. So now, there are 2 ways to look at, we're not going to skirt the issue. Just want to give some background here. So there are 2 ways to look at this issue. Right? The issue of suicide. One is that most likely any person who's going to do that, they're not in their right mind. Right? Unless it's proven they are in their right mind. Like in the case of someone who's terminally ill. Right? But even someone who's terminally ill, you might say there's something wrong with them anyway to want to do that, but they don't want to live anymore. They, that's it. They don't want to live anymore. So we can't, so that I understand. That would be clear as being suicide. But someone who does something, someone who commits suicide, and it's done because of depression. It's done because of trauma. It's done because of stigma. Right? So they would have to show, and there would have to be a history over here, right, of mental illness. And if it's shown that there's mental illness, which most likely will be the case, right, it's probably not going to be that hard to show, then if they have mental illness and a history of mental illness, we're not going to look at that as suicide, right? And the reason is because they're not in their right mind, right? They have to recognize, what's the difference between good and bad. They have to be, normal. I mean, it doesn't mean they have to have 120 IQ. Certainly doesn't mean that. But they have to be like, like most normal people. And most normal people, unless something really tragic happened. I mean, you could see, we could ask the question during COVID, right? The irony is some people, a lot of people lost their businesses, because of COVID. And we're not going to go into COVID itself, but, a lot of people lost their business. And if they didn't lose their business, they survived. Sometimes their business got looted, right? And they got destroyed that way. So the suicide rate was up. Why? Because he had people couldn't provide for their families, right? They couldn't provide for their families. They lost their business. They lost everything. No sense of worth, et cetera. Put their lives, into this business. They got nothing left. So somebody like that's under tremendous mental anguish. Yeah, there's no question. At the same time, there's going to be an issue over here. What's the issue? The issue is up until this point, let's just say for argument's sake, there was no mental issues at all. They were normal people, normal blue collar, white collar, whatever you want to call them, right? Whatever it is. They were normal. They had no signs. They had nothing, no mental illness. Now this comes along. They can't provide. They got creditors calling them up. Credit lines are being declined. They have no money. They have very little, they can't buy food. They're maxed up to the gazoo. They have no way to pay anything. What are they supposed to do? What are they supposed to do? Right? So the suicide rate was up, right? There's no question. Now, how does the Torah view such people? Now, we could look at it very simply and say, well, up until this point, if it's clear there was no mental illness, right? They understand exactly what they're doing. They took 150 sleeping pills. Yeah, and they slept forever. Killed them, right? Or they took a gun, whatever, jumped off a cliff, whatever it is, that they did. But the second before they jumped, weren't they in their right mind at that point? Seemingly they were in their right mind. You could argue. But what drove them to jump? What drove them to jump? They were in a terrible state of depression. Right now, if that's the case, and you can show, even if there was no mental illness before, but it could be shown that the person was totally distraught, right? That's mental illness. Because even if a person is in that situation, they're going through that much difficulty, it doesn't necessarily mean, a person's going to OD over here or is going to jump off a cliff or kill themselves or whatever, right? It doesn't mean that. And, it also doesn't mean they necessarily have mental illness, right? They've been through trauma. They've been through a major trauma, right? Government's not allowing them to work. They can't go out. They lose everything, right, over time. So you blame the government, blame this. It doesn't matter. The point is they can't pay workers. They can't pay whoever they owe money to, for merchandise. They can't pay for food. They can't pay for anything. So this is one time. Maybe this is the only time it happened to somebody. They had this kind of difficulty. They're cut off on all ends. Well, when you're cut off on all ends, no one should ever be in a situation. You got no credit cards. You got no family help, and food is running down. You have no idea what you're going to do. So a person can get desperate. They could get violent. They could steal. There are many things that could lead to. Now, that doesn't necessarily say that's mental illness. What that says is they're doing whatever it takes to survive. They're in survival mode, maybe never been in the situation before, maybe will never be in the situation again, right? But at the end, they do desperate things because they're desperate. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not in their right mind, right? And there's mental illness. Now, it is true they are going through absolute trauma. That is not to be pushed away over here. That's not to say, well, because they went through trauma, it doesn't really matter. They were still in their right mind. So now this is where it gets a little bit dodgy. Because the reality is, most people in this case, they are in their right mind. They are just absolutely desperate. But someone would have to be really, really desperate, to do that, to take their lives because they see no other solution. If you tell me by all these teenagers, God forbid, these Jewish teenagers who go off and they end up on drugs and they drug overdose or whatever. So the major trauma they've gone through is sexual abuse. That's probably the major trauma, most likely, right? Is the major trauma. So now you get somebody who's, seemingly in their right mind. They have suffered, right? There is no question. This is a little bit drastic, right? It is a little bit drastic, but we could say because of the trauma, because of the difficulty that they've gone through, then what are we going to say? We'll say that's a form of mental illness because in normal circumstances, they never, ever would have done this. If they would have seen things are going to get, things potentially getting better, more stimulus checks, I don't know, Biden keep writing off the checks, billions of dollars over here, just add on to the deficit. Okay, right? It's going to save some people. Right? Now, some people won't end up committing suicide because they have some way to survive. There is some way that they're actually going to survive. So they may not see the light at the end of the tunnel, but they're not going to do something so drastic. But what do you do? What do you do if you're somebody, you got no family help, you got no help whatsoever, everything's closing in, right? All the creditors, credit cards, everything's closing in. You have nowhere to turn. So when a person gets desperate, that's one thing that comes up in their mind. Why do I need this? I'm never going to get out of it. There's no possible way, right? There's no possible way according to the natural scheme of things, they're ever going to come out of this hole. They're ever going to come out of this, in a normal way. So what do? They say, you know what? I might as well just end it. There's no reason for me to be alive over here. And the reason is because I have no hope. And someone who's going to commit suicide, they're at the end of the rope. No pun intended. They're at the end of the rope because they feel that there is no other solution, right? Forget about whether they have, life insurance or not, or they feel there's no other solution. But because what a lot of these people went through, they lost their dignity. They lost their ability to provide for their family. Right now, if someone has, had a company or been working for a company, got laid off, they can't work, this, that, and then they can't make ends meet. That can certainly lead to someone in depression, to other things, as well. So I could very well hear, on the one hand, you got to be pretty desperate to do that. There's got to be some mental illness there right before the person died, or do we say no? Do we say we don't have a history of mental illness? Yes, this was a trauma. This was a definite trauma. Then all the psychologists are gonna, ram me over here and say, come on, trauma causes mental illness also. It does, right? There's no question whether it can be any number of things, right? Any number of things a person can go to. So trauma is not something to say, well, he's still in his right mind. He still knows what's up. He can still, do whatever, and he's relatively normal. It's just, okay, he's getting hammered. He's getting totally hammered over here. So even if we're going to look at it and say, this person up until COVID, no issues, no mental issues. He understood it, or she understood exactly what they're going through. They understood, right? They understood. The problem is they've gone through a major trauma. Now, going through a major trauma over here is akin to mental illness. And if it's akin to mental illness, we can't hold them responsible, right? We're not going to be able to hold them. I mean, not that we're judging here. We're asking what the Torah says over here. So the point is that God should cut them some slack, right? Certainly, if it's shown that the only reason this was caused was because of the trauma that they went through. Now, that would be something, someone has an upheaval in business, and, these are unusual circumstances. Because normally someone has an upheaval in business, it doesn't mean it just goes totally out of control and that's it. They take their lives. Depends what it is. It depends what they go through. But, okay, people lose and then they rebuild. And then, they could lose and rebuild again. It goes in cycles. I'm not going to say across the board that's the case, but it can certainly happen. Right? I don't think there's any question. People take business upheavals all the time, right? It's what happens. It's all the time, whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is, it can happen. It can certainly happen. Now the question is, how far does it go? And there are definitely going to be different levels over here, as we mentioned last week. There are going to be different types of mental illness. Some things, they'd be more liable for. Some things they'd be less liable for. It depends what it is. Right. And, in this case, it's a little bit different because someone has a financial upheaval. Over time, they can build themselves back. Even if they declare bankruptcy, they start again. Different business, something else, doesn't matter. They'll regroup over time. This was a totally different issue, right? COVID just shut everything down. And it shut everything down for so long. Right? A person says, well, it's not about rebuilding over here. This is going to take a monumental effort. It's going to take such a monumental effort, I'm never going to recover. Right? There's no possible way. Okay, declare bankruptcy. But I can't even start again. There's nothing open. There's nothing for me to go to. Right? Stimulus checks aren't doing anything. Right? So what can I do over here? So then the person loses it. So something like that's a major trauma. It's no different. I would say it's no different than mental illness. It's causing them to go off the deep end when they normally wouldn't have. Because if it's a normal business upheaval, right? Again, some people take it harder, some people not, but it's the way of the world. It certainly can happen. It's not like so far-fetched, person's in business, and then something happens that, they take a tremendous downside. They don't lose everything. They could, doesn't necessarily mean they will. Right. So in that case, I wouldn't say it's as severe, but there are people also, if they're used to a certain life standard and, certain things happen, they're not going to have that life standard. They hit, pretty much rock bottom and whatever. They don't want to live that way and they end it because they just can't live that way anymore. So that's also tragic. I didn't take a survey I don't want people hammering me and say, hey, how do you know what the stats are? I don't know what the stats are, right? I'm guessing that even if a person has a major upheaval, does not necessarily mean they're going to take their lives. And I don't think most business owners that lose everything take their lives. I don't think that's the case. It just so happens in COVID, the numbers were up. Numbers were way up because it was a totally different situation, right? They didn't have a chance to regroup. They didn't have a chance to get bailed out or anything else. Everything was shut down, right? So that's a major trauma. I don't think there's any question. Even if they know what they're doing, it's probably gonna be pretty clear that the person was distraught. The person didn't know what to do. They felt like, like toothpaste, they're being squeezed, so to speak. They're being squeezed all over. They have no way to pay anything. Never really been in such a situation, or maybe a little bit, but nothing like this. They find no way out. And the noose around their neck is getting stronger. They feel there's no way out. They just say, okay, I have a family, I have children, I have a wife, this, that. I can't face anybody anymore. It's way too embarrassing. I have no way to bring in food, right? That's enough to draw someone off the deep end. So all it would have to be shown, which I don't think this would be too hard, all you would have to show is the person was under mental anguish. And that mental anguish that, threw them over the cliff, right? So we could say that by anything. So this is where it gets a little bit hard, because anyone who's going to do this, they have to be under some sort of mental anguish or something like that. They're not really in their right mind, right? But that there are levels, there are levels over here. So when it comes to now we'll get to the original question here. When it comes to mental illness, right, and someone is schizophrenic and they do it to themselves, how can we say they're liable? We can't say they're liable, right? It's impossible to say they're liable because they're not in their right mind, right? They're 100% not in their right mind, right? So they're not recognizing anything as being real, right? They're, they got the Sybil complex. They got, multiple personalities. They're somewhere else, through hallucination, other things. They're just not lucid, right? But they're beyond lucid over here. They're a few steps beyond that. So they don't know what they're doing. Now, someone who doesn't know what they're doing, they don't have the mental capacity to do it, to think about what they're doing. And let's say they end up doing it to themselves through carelessness, through other things. They're going to have a normal funeral, right? It's going to be tragic, but they're going to have a normal funeral. And the reason, according to Jewish law, because they're not in their right mind, right? 100% they're not in their right mind. My only question was, in certain cases, could we say, without necessarily mental illness, could we say that a person's really in their right mind, right? And they do it, but it's really caused by stress or something else, which is probably the case. So even in those cases, most likely we'd have to say that they're going to be, they're not going to be liable here, because there's an underlying factor. The underlying factor is, whatever it is, depression, schizophrenia. There are people, there was a movie, I forget what it was called. It was a movie with Michael Douglas, and he just snaps. He just has this one day, he's like sitting in traffic and whatever, and he just totally snaps, and he walks into a store, and he's got a gun. It wasn't a real gun, but whatever, and it actually did have a gun. And he's like, how much for the Twinkies? Guy's like, $3.50. He's like, wrong answer. Destroys half the store. He's like, how much for the water? He's like, $2.20. Whatever. And in the end, he's being chased by the police, and he's he's at a pier, he's at a dock, by the water, and the police tell him to freeze, this, that, and he pulls out a gun, and they shoot him. They end up shooting him, and he dies. Right? But the gun was a toy gun. So why do I mention that? I'm not even sure why I mentioned that. I mentioned that because this guy totally snapped. Something happened, right? He had a horrible day, whatever, and, it was 95 degrees, 80%, 90% humidity, and he just lost it. He just totally lost it. Had a terrible day, and he just went ballistic, and he totally lost it. Now, I think it's a little more far-fetched, but something can happen which can trigger a reaction, right? And it can trigger all kinds of different reactions. A person, let's say having trouble with the spouse. The spouse threatens, that, you don't shape up, whatever, that's it. I'll divorce you, whatever. And the guy then, or the woman starts to drink, starts to do other things. Or, and it just spirals. It can spiral out of control. Normally things don't. Normally it's something that happens over time. It builds over time. So if it builds over time, what are we going to say? There's something else going on, right? There's normally a case of, mental illness. If it's a case of mental illness, right, then the person 100% should be exempt because they are not in control. Now, we mentioned before in general, there's going to be, we're going to have to see what cases we're talking about. Because we mentioned last week, you cannot judge every case the same. Every case is going to have to be judged in and of itself. You have people that, let's say they, victims of the Holocaust saw their family killed before them, in front of their face. They have tattoos, they leave Judaism, and they have scars. They have, certainly mental scars, etc. They go out and do certain things. Listen, they've been through trauma. Trauma is a real thing. I don't think there's any question. But you have to look at things on an individual basis. So, so the Talmud tells us that mental illness in general is separate from who the person really is. Right? It's taking away a person from himself, understanding himself, certainly understanding God, and also person, if they have mental illness, they have to pursue healing for it. And certainly if someone has whatever issues, other people, family around them, right, should be there for them. They should support them. They should try and help them. So Rav Asher Weiss, one of the Torah giants of this generation, has the response of, and I'll just see how far this goes. And he has the response of about somebody, a student who was devout, God-fearing, and he suffered from obsessive compulsive disorder, right? And so for the most part, they had issues saying blessings. They didn't know if they said God's name right, or they say it over and over to make sure they have the right intention, or they say the Shema, they're saying it a number of times, and it could take them a long time, right? As we mentioned, trying to say God's name, and then they don't end up saying God's name because they're not really, they just, they have issues. They have issues. Did I really say it right? Am I going to say it right? It causes them tremendous amount of anguish. Now, if you ask the doctors who are experts in this condition, now, what's the treatment? What's the treatment never going to be? The treatment is never go back in prayer, right? That is going to be the treatment because, again, there is also Jewish law. In other words, you say what you say. You got, unless you missed it egregiously, when you say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Right? If you didn't have intention that God runs the world, is in charge of the world above, the world below, God is past, present, and future, you have to go back and say it again. That's minimal intention. Everything else I say, the paragraph about taking on the yoke of mitzvahs, reward and punishment, second paragraph, and all that, if I didn't have any intention whatsoever, I still fulfill my obligation. Right? But in general, in this case, what are we going to say? We're going to say, if you said it, you said it. You don't go back. You don't go back in prayer because then you're never going to finish. Right? You're going to be stuck in the same place over and over and over. Right? Now, the reason is because he doesn't feel he said the prayer properly. So if he didn't say the prayer properly, he's not sure. He's not convinced he said the prayer properly. Then he got a problem. And he's got a problem. He shouldn't try it again. Right? So he has to go through some sort of, cognitive behavioral therapy, as we call it in the vernacular, CBT, or other types of therapy. There's a thing called exposure response prevention therapy, EXRP. Anyone wants to look it up. And there are ways to definitely try and treat it where doctors hope to save him from his distress. Now, one important thing that we have to be aware of before we go any further is that this person's got OCD, right? If he's a yeshiva student, he's seeing an Orthodox Jew as a psychologist. You're not seeing a secular Jew or a secular non-Jew, because they're going to rip him to shreds. They're going to say, what do you care? You fulfill the obligation, didn't fulfill the obligation. You have to have somebody who is sensitive to the needs of the Orthodox community, right? If they're sensitive to the needs, they know what's going on over here. Because the person's driving themselves nuts. They wash their hands 100 times. They're not sure. They wash their hands enough, for bread, or they got cleaned or whatever. So there is therapy. There is definitely therapy that can help. Now, it can directly affect, certainly, one's religious observance. So if a person suffers from OCD, right, there are many things that they're going to have to work on over here, because they are going to be scrupulous in mitzvah observance, more scrupulous than anyone ever in the history of man. They're going to be so over scrupulous, overthinking that they're never going to get anywhere over here. Not only that, they're going to have these intrusive thoughts. They're going to have images, certainly with counter-religious themes. It's going to cause anxiety. It's going to cause distress. It's going to cause excessive fears of God and punishment, and that is going to destroy them. Because here they're worried, I did it right, I didn't do it right, and if I didn't do it right, and I didn't have the right intention, it could drive anybody nuts, even without OCD, right? But you're thinking over here, okay, I ate enough matzah, I didn't eat enough matzah, what do I do over here? So, interesting, comes along Rav Asher Weiss, right? Rav Asher Weiss over here says, first of all, we have to see what halacha does over here, right? We have to see how the intricacy of Jewish law, is able, to have a person live a normal life, to a normal religious life, right? But if that goes awry due to illness, as we mentioned by OCD, right, it has nothing to do with Judaism and halacha itself. See, people make the mistake, right, where someone tried to hammer me last week, isn't Judaism too hard? No, it's not. There are a lot of laws. There's a lot of things we have to do, and we have to learn, and we have to get it right, right? There's a lot of things we have to do. We may not do it right all the time. We may make mistakes. A lot of things we have to do tshuva for, to repent for. But so what if there are a lot of laws? Well, Judaism's too hard. Well, what should we do? What should we do? Let's cut out all these mitzvahs. Let's be reforming conservative Jews. Is that the answer? No, that's not the answer. Because they're 70-80% into marriage, right? They include everybody, do all kinds of things. It doesn't work, right? So in that case, what am I going to say? You're right. It's a hard life. If a Jew's born into it, that's, we don't have a choice over here. We have to keep it anyway. But if we believe it's true, we're going to keep it. We're going to do it, even if it is hard. You're right. It's hard. Right? So what if it's hard? There are a lot of things that are hard. But if it'd be so easy, everyone would keep it? Of course not. Right? So there's a lot of work. There's a lot of hard work over here. That doesn't matter. That doesn't negate the fact that God gave the Torah. That doesn't negate the fact that God doesn't change the Torah. It doesn't negate anything. It just means it's harder. So we want to water it down. What are we going to water it down for? It's going to be a disaster. Right? And the Torah doesn't even tell me I'm allowed to do that. But I don't even want to digress over here. Because religious actions and thoughts appear to be symptoms of OCD. Because a person can think, maybe I didn't do it, right, and I have to concentrate more, and I have to do this, I have to do that. It could drive anybody nuts, but if you have OCD, multiply by infinity, right? So there are other symptoms over here. There could be other symptoms that lead to anxiety, lead to all kinds of things. So now we can understand, that really Jewish law and the Torah itself, it's supposed to bring us great joy. You're right. There are a lot of details, tremendous amount of details. But you know what? When we perform a mitzvah and we do it right, forget about Kabbalah. We sing and dance a little bit more, and we thank God we're not non-Jews, right? We thank God we have so many mitzvahs to do, right? And we have so many good things and, such inspiration. Okay. That doesn't mean it's easy. No one said it's easy. It's not supposed to be easy, right? But that's the way I'm supposed to get close to God over here, right? So the whole point is to bring us closer to Him, to bring us great joy. And someone will say, well, you know what? How can it bring great joy if you're too busy worried if you did the right thing, you didn't do the right thing? Okay, that's part of Jewish law also, right? But if I understand it's to my benefit, and if I understand here, we just finished with Sukkot, so I'll take my lulav over here, is my lulav, right? And we're shaking it like this, and we're shaking it like that all during Sukkot, and you have to know the laws. You have to know what a kosher lulav looks like, doesn't look like. You have a rabbi checking to make sure it's okay, right? But these are things you have to review. You have to understand what it is. There's a lot of things. There are a lot of things that, it could drive people off the deep end, right? It could. Could it lead to someone to be OCD? Could, in theory. But, I don't know what the stats are, but I don't think most people in the Orthodox community are OCD. I think there are a lot of people who are scrupulous in mitzvahs. I think they work really hard. And by working really hard, okay, maybe they drive themselves a little bit nuts. Doesn't necessarily make them OCD, right? But there are a lot of details for a reason. You just don't understand, right? This, whoever's going to make such a comment, you don't understand how the Torah works. You don't understand what God wants from us. You can say, well, maybe the Jewish people don't either. Maybe we got a lot of room to grow. You're right, we do. But so what? If we believe the Torah is true, there are all these details. I have to keep it. That's it. God says, I don't care. Shut up and eat the matzah. You got to eat 25 pounds of matzah in 25 seconds and whistle Dixie. With all the wine, come to my Seder. You will see Elijah the prophet. Right? That I can promise. Right? So now over here, right, when it comes to Jewish law, the first obligation a person has to do is in this case, you got to find healing from the illness. Right? Even something that's permitted him to bypass and not do mitzvahs in the Torah. They may be exempt because the person is OCD. They're worried about this, worried about that, worried about the other thing. So there are certain mitzvahs they may not end up doing. But if they not end up doing it, there's a leniency over here. What's the leniency? The leniency is they're not in the right mind over here because they have an issue. OCD is the real thing. Right? So Rav Asher Weiss brings a response from the Chassam Sofer, lived in the 1800s or early 1900s. Right? The Chassam Sofer wrote of a child deemed to be insane. Right? Child seemed to be insane. And he answered whether it was permitted to send him to an institution where they take care of them, and there's a chance of healing him, and taking him out of the category of someone who's insane. Right? And making him obligated in mitzvahs. Problem was, the institution did not serve kosher food. Right? So, also, so that's the question. Can he be healed? And if he's going to be healed, this is an institution to send him to, but they don't serve kosher food. But the kid's insane. Right? So one part of the argument is if the kid's insane, they're going to eat non-kosher food also, because it's still going to help him over here. Right? It's still going to help him get better. Right? Similar to the case where the rabbis tell us that a person is allowed to violate one Shabbos so he can later keep many Shabbases. So if we don't allow this person to skip mitzvahs even a little bit, if you don't cut him any slack, you say, well, Jewish law is strict, you got to do this, got to do that, but the person's OCD. He's OCD, he's not going to be able to do all the mitzvahs, what he's obligated in. So you cut him some slack. So Rav Asher Weiss over here says you cut him some slack, because if you don't do that, he's never going to heal. He's going to continue skipping mitzvahs and may not do anything after a while. Right? So it's preferable because of his distress that this is certainly the way to go. And he brings a medrash. And he brings a medrash from Psalms number 45. He says, my heart whispers good things. That's to say that if one cannot confess with his mouth, his heart can whisper in tshuva. His heart can whisper in repentance. God is going to accept his confession. And King David says to Shlomo, my son, know God your father, serve him with a full heart and a free soul. Right? So if that's the case, then even, that's our goal. Even if a person has mental illness. Not all mental illness is not able to be treated. Some more, some less. It comes to, let's say, being bipolar. I happen to know someone who's bipolar, diagnosed later in life. But, they got the right medication. And you wouldn't even know. You wouldn't even know there's an issue with them at all, because they're so normal. But the reason they're so normal is because they're on this medication. They go off this medication. They have other issues, right? Someone who's a schizophrenic also. It's all about the right balance, right? There's an imbalance over there, right? Well, it's all about the balance of medicine, and sometimes, you take too much or too little, it throws the body off balance, and then the person can have, episodes. So, but you need, in these type of things, a person is going to need two things, right? They certainly may need medication, right? At least to balance things out. But at the same time, they're going to need therapy as well, right? And that's not a taboo thing, certainly not a taboo thing anymore. Therapy used to be a taboo thing years ago. But, today it's a normal thing. So someone going through those kind of difficulties, they're going to need help. They're going to need, serious medication. And with the serious medication, they're going to need therapy as well. Now, even someone who's schizophrenic, they can lead a normal life. There's no reason why not. The question's going to be if they do something when they're acting out. They're not on the medication. Or I mentioned last week this person had a questionable conversion. If he's not on his medication, he's got mental issues, right? No question, he's got mental issues, right? So they converted him when he was lucid. So when he's lucid, fine. Then he's obligated to mitzvahs. When he's not lucid, he thinks he can, walk on water, right? If he's not lucid, he's exempt. He's totally exempt over here. Also, extremely important, just while we're ending here, right? A person, certainly, they have mental health issues, needs a, tremendous social support, right? Having someone else to speak to in times of trouble, that type of thing, going to therapy on a regular basis, but they need a support group, right? That there's no, that there's no question. And, an example of, not holding an individual in the throes of mental illness, right? An example is something, let's say it comes up in someone is bipolar, which we mentioned, right? It consists of alternating periods of depression and mania. It includes euphoria, racing thoughts, increased energy, impulsivity, risk-taking behavior, spending sprees, out of character, different things. So somebody like that, when they act out, it's not their fault, right? Essentially, it's not their fault, but there's a reality. They're acting out because of this disorder. Now, again, it doesn't mean the disorder can't be worked on, can't be helped, and it can't be overcome. There are people that certainly overcome it. When it comes, schizophrenia, I would say a little more difficult, just based on the, chemical imbalance and, and other things. But, that can also be helped, certainly through medication and certainly through therapy. If a person stops either, they're a time bomb. They're an absolute time bomb. So, in that case, if they do anything, right, if they do anything that cause damage, right, they're still going to be liable. The reality is they're still going to be liable. They're not in their right mind. Really, they should be exempt, right? But the reality is they will be liable. They will be liable for, things they break, or, they can't say, well, I was under mental anguish. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Someone's going to have to pay. Even if a person, let's say, has a child, and that child is mentally challenged, and that child breaks something, and they cause damage. Now, the reality is that child, even over the age of bar mitzvah, should be liable, right? They don't know what they're doing, right? And again, it depends how high functioning, other things. But in short, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. Really, they should be exempt. But if you would do that, it wouldn't be such a good thing. Parents, definitely should pay. But in general, when it comes to mental illness, we should say 100%, they're not in their right mind. They're not in the right mind. But even so, if you live in a place where the law of the land, let's get to a whole nother discussion, which we're not going to get to, but, let's just make it easy. Let's say someone causes damage, and, they had mental issues. And if they had mental issues, the law of the land says they're liable. So they're going to have to pay from somewhere, either them, the parents, whatever. A person's going to lock them up, psychiatric evaluation, they'll keep them locked up, they're not going to be in jail because obviously they're not in the right mind, right, etc. But, you have to go also according to the law of the land. Now, even if we would say in normal cases, maybe a person, if they do something like that, and they should be maybe they'll be exempt because they don't know they don't know what they're doing, right? In the case of you give a show to someone who's like insane, you give them money, they just rip it up. You give them something, they just destroy it, right? Something like that. So someone like that, yeah, they should be exempt. They should be exempt, from damage. Law of the land might be different. Law of the land might say, okay, they're going to be a mental institution for at least the next 5 years, because of what they did. And let's say they maimed someone, they broke their leg, I don't know, whatever damage they caused, the law of the land is going to throw the book at them. Right. And say, why weren't there medication? Why weren't this? Other things, and the law of the land could certainly override that. But that's that's another issue. That's a whole nother
show. In other words,
that's a whole nother episode. We're not going to get to because we don't have
Speaking
time.
of which, I hate to cut you off, but we got to run. I've got another show starting in 15 minutes, and I've got the rabbi calling me now. So anyway, it's been a good show. I think we do need to visit this again because there's other scenarios. I think you're touching in where people are interested in hearing. So,
but just give me more time. Just give me more time, like Scotty. Come on.
These shows are jam packed together. I wish I could. All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in, Rabbi. Thank you for your time. It's awesome learning from you, and I know everybody else feels the same. So I hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you. For those wanting to tune in to Rabbi Moshe Shulman, they'll be starting at 12:45. So hopefully we'll see you guys soon. Rabbi, thanks again. Y'all have a great week. Shalom, everybody.